In general terms, we can say that every film begins with the equilibrium of the first act, and then is unsettled by the disruption of the first plot point. In the second act, there is an attempt to return to equilibrium until an event occurs midway through the second act, which escalates the action toward the permanent loss of equilibrium. This is the midpoint. As the action develops further, and just when the permanent loss of equilibrium seems inevitable, the central character overcomes the main obstacle. This is the second plot point and the end of Act 2. The remainder of the film is the third act. In the third act, the promise of something new based on something familiar returns the world of the film to a new sense of equilibrium. In the final act of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy not only achieves her goal of returning home, but she now has a new sense of herself and of those around her. She has changed and, as a result, has achieved a new sense of equilibrium.
The third act is often referred to as the resolution. The French called it the denouement, or the unraveling. The purpose of the third act is to tie up the remaining threads of the story, to make clear to the audience the ramifications of the story that they just viewed. There is typically what can be referred to as an epilogue plot point in the final pages of the third act, which is an action or event which is a physical representation of the new clarity achieved.
In The Wizard of Oz, after Dorothy has defeated her foe, she now must contend with a cruel and insensitive Wizard of Oz. We soon find out, however, that all is not as it appears, as the real wizard turns out to be a timid, bumbling mortal. The wizard even tells Dorothy, "I'm a very good man. I'm just a very bad wizard." The notion that all things are not as they seem is reinforced as the wizard awards pointless tokens to the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, and, by virtue of telling them that they now have brains, a heart, and courage, they are suddenly endowed with these qualities. As a result, the audience members take away the knowledge that these characters had these qualities all along, but needed to prove it to themselves. It isn't until the wizard has inadvertently left Dorothy behind that Glinda assures Dorothy that she, too, has had the power to return to Kansas all along. When asked why she didn't tell Dorothy this to begin with, Glinda replies, she had to find it out for herself. This seems to be the explicit message of the film.
The epilogue plot point of the film occurs when Dorothy clicks her heels together and returns to Kansas, where she resolves that there's no place like home.
The third act of a film should offer clarity for the audience. The inner logic of the world must be justified. There needs to be a sense of fate that it really couldn't have ended any other way. The action should reinforce the main point of the story. The point or theme of the film should be explained and reconciled with the action.
In the third act of M. Night Shyamalan's film, The Sixth Sense, the epilogue plot point of the film occurs when the central character, along with the audience, discovered that he has been dead all along. But the shock of this recognition is not enough to make a film. The action which follows explains why he was dead and why it was necessary for him to return from the dead to assist the young, troubled boy. We learn that the central character's advice, listen to them, to his troubled young patient, was not only true for the boy, but true for him as well, and, implicitly, for the audience.
So let's summarize. The basic formula for the screenplay is organized around what has been referred to as the three-act structure. Act 1, which occupies approximately 30 pages of the script, is for the purpose of establishing the world of the film. It introduces the protagonist, or central character, and the crucial relationships between the characters. On or around page 30 of the screenplay, an action or event occurs which disrupts the world of the film and forces the protagonist to contend with an obstacle that he must overcome. This action or event is referred to as the first plot point. The action of the first plot point throws the world of the film into a completely different set of conditions and/or circumstances. The main conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist is introduced. The main obstacle is presented. This is Act 2 of the screenplay. Act 2 can be described as the development. The protagonist attempts to overcome or get around the main obstacle. This attempt continues until, midway through the second act, an action occurs which escalates the action of the second act. This is the mid-plot point. The action continues until the protagonist and antagonist face off, or the protagonist reaches the final showdown with the main obstacle. The result of this showdown makes up the second plot point. The completion of the second plot point begins the action of the third act.
The third act can be referred to as the resolution. This is where the action is explained, the themes of the story are underscored, and the audience is left with a feeling of resolution and clarity. This is made evident in the epilogue plot point, where the protagonist engages in an action or event which represents the new equilibrium and clarifies the meaning of the film.
I would be remiss if I didn't once again point out that there are many great films which did not follow this formula. George Lucas's 1972 film, American Graffiti, had very amusing and compelling action. But there was no clear protagonist. There was no sense that the action of the film was organized around any single character. There was no clear or obvious main crisis or main obstacle. In his film Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock killed off his protagonist midway through the film. The choice was a shocking one. A closer look at the film, however, shows that Hitchcock used this action as a mid-plot point and spun the action in such a way as to create Norman Bates as a new protagonist and Norman's mother as the antagonist. Of course, this was all resolved when, in true Oedipal fashion, Hitchcock revealed that the protagonist and antagonist were the same person. It's important to be aware of the formula for an industry-standard screenplay so you can be aware of the structure of your favorite movie. It's also important to know how these rules are being broken and how these daring artistic choices can lead to original and fascinating cinema.